Today we're going to be talking about the 1920s. The last couple times we talked about the relationship between the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. We saw the problems of the Gilded Age, immigration, urbanization, industrialization, all had really caused social issues that progressives in the Progressive Era tried to come together, sometimes in tension, sometimes in concert together to overcome. Historians tend to end the Progressive Era at 1920, and it's because the 20s seem to kind of have a life of their own. If you think about the 1920s, it's usually defined by prosperity, rapid changes in culture, modernization. The 20s are really defined by this sense of prosperity, the sense that the nation is really economically going somewhere. Often referred to as the Jazz Age, the Age of the Flapper, the Golden 20s, the Dollar Decade. You can see that that really kind of typifies this focus on economic boom of cultural proliferation that really happens. You think of the Roaring 20s. This is something that both historians and in popular culture, the 20s are really known for. One of the things that really marks the kind of downswing of the Progressive Era is the end of World War I. And as President Warren Harding put it in the 1920s, he said that there was this kind of longing for peacetime or return to normalcy, especially referring to kind of the progressive ethos. The quote here that I have of Harding, he says, America's present need is not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy, not revolution, but restoration, not agitation or adjustment, not surgery, but serenity, not the dramatic, but the dispassionate, not experiment, not submergence in internationality, but sustainment and triumphant nationality. So essentially what he's saying there is the progressive push, this really overturning the world to kind of create new systems and to reform on a large scale is really not what Americans were feeling in the 20s. The post-war affluence that begins to happen lays the groundwork for kind of a return to the status quo in a sense, and so the progressive ethos gets curtailed just a little bit. I think on the executive level, we really see this. Calvin Coolidge becomes president from 23 to 29, essentially kind of the thrust of the majority of the decade. Coolidge here is this, his quote is, "The chief business of American people is business." He talks about a man who builds a factory builds a temple, and a man who works there worships at it. So you can see that there is this focus on the economy, the economic boom, that really is going to define that decade in a very clear sense. What's really going to undergird this is the explosion of not just the post-war economy, but this focus on production of automobiles. By the 1920s, the U.S. is producing 85% of the world's automobiles. 40% of all manufactured goods are coming from the U.S., so you can see how this dollar decade is really pushing the nation in this economic direction. The clearest example of this is Henry Ford. Henry Ford, the most admired man in America at the time, is the quote, is how he's remembered at that point. He had built one of the first gas-driven carriages. A decade later, he has started the Ford Motor Company, and this explodes. By 1929, 1 in 4 Americans are working in some kind of relationship to the automobile industry. And we'll see how as we move closer to 1929, this actually becomes problematic. This idea of Fordism kind of encapsulates a couple of themes here. One, that we saw how progressivism, outside of its social aspect, had driven effectiveness, efficiency, honing the mass-produced line in order to create something that's more affordable and more efficient. Also, we can see specifically with Henry Ford, he's pulling in kind of progressive ideas and then pulling them into a more capitalist system. So, in one sense, is known as producing, a car every 93 minutes. Fordism also is known for introducing this concept of welfare capitalism, right? The idea that factories are safe places, they're sanitary, you have a pension fund, your worker can afford the product that's being produced there. It's very different than that Gilded Age idea of just squishing as much as you can out of the workforce and throwing away the labor at the end of the day. Critics of welfare capitalism would say that these are just minor capitulations to the worker, and really in the end this is to benefit the elite moneyed class. They will use the term industrial paternalism, right? That this is a nicer, more palatable version of a company town. Whichever the perspective, what we do know is the economy is exploding, and things like the Model T, or the ability to drive a car, to have access to these new technological innovations and involved, it becomes a cultural cultural symbol, right? So we have this explosion of a consumer society. We have, these first real clear examples of large-scale marketing. We have celebrities. If you think of the emergence of Babe Ruth, boxing, sports celebrities begin to emerge. What we have is the explosion of a consumer culture that really will define the 20th century. The thing that will define the 1920s is prohibition. The 18th Amendment that would prohibit the sale and distribution of alcohol went into effect in 1920. Many people hated it. All this really did was create black markets for alcohol. We see speakeasies, these secret bars that begin to emerge where there is this culture of partaking in illicit behavior, right? Everything becomes kind of privatized behind closed doors. We see the rise of organized crime that becomes associated with this. It really didn't do anything to keep Americans from drinking. There's simultaneously massive government spending on suppressing alcohol distribution and sales while there's still whiskey flowing even in the White House. Understanding the evolution of the women's sphere in America helps give us special insight into the 1920s. After women's suffrage was passed, the 19th Amendment in 1920, there was a faction of American women that said that that was not the end goal, but just the beginning. In 1923, there was the Equal Rights Amendment that gets pushed forth by the activist Alice Paul and her coalition of women that she had brought around herself. What this essentially is an argument that there should be an amendment to the Constitution that says that it would be illegal for any discrimination based on sex to occur. Oddly enough, there were many women that were against this. Some gender-specific protections actually favored particularly working-class women in the workforce. And so there you see a division that begins to happen in American women that say that there should be this amendment, usually middle to upper-class women who are arguing for equal political rights, and oftentimes lower to lower middle-class women who actually benefited from certain gender divisions that we see, particularly in the workplace. While we might think such a simplistic thing should be passed and there should be an amendment that says that there's no discrimination based on sex or gender, as we would put it now, this actually is something that did not pass in the 1920s, again, won't pass many times throughout the 20th century, and still has not been passed to the present. But if political feminism was failing, cultural feminism exploded in the 1920s. So if we think about the 1920s, we'll often see the word new woman or flapper. What this essentially is this new freedom that American women, particularly in cities, begins to be able to partake in. This is often symbolized by short hair, short skirts, dancing, the ability to travel with men in cars, do things that were, previously not just prohibited, but probably not even possible. Speakeasies, dance halls, music clubs, all of these places provide new and exciting places for young women to go and to partake, to have close relationships with men outside of the older version of adult oversight that kind of defined rural America for the past century. The new woman starts to get marked by this idea of short bobbed hair, smoking cigarettes, right, talking to men in bars, something that was essentially forbidden or inaccessible prior to this. What had been scandalous or frowned upon or completely inaccessible a decade, 2 decades before this, now wasn't just accessible, but it was marketed, it was mass marketed to women in order to pull people into the consumer market and to sell things back to them. This real shift of having private spaces, of having, illegal bars or automobiles where men and women can be together and partake sexually or privately in ways that were unavailable before, has made many historians begin to point to the 1920s as really this sexual revolution that predated the sexual revolution we think of the 1960s. And in the 1920s, just like in the 1960s, decades later, this created a culture war over what was proper, what was moral, what was right in mainstream society. This wasn't just limited to liberation or cultural manifestations. We also have, these private spaces or speakeasies became very early in the 20s places for homosexual activity. We began to see the celebration of gender-bending norms, gay bars very early in the 20s in New York. We also see a push. Margaret Sanger will come out in the 1920s, and she'll begin to criticize the tying together of female subordination to procreation, and she'll say that there should be access to sex education, to birth control methods. Eventually, she will lay the groundwork for what will become Planned Parenthood in the next decades. Sanger became one of the most virile birth control advocates. She ended up being persecuted. She had to leave the U.S. because she had violated laws about censorship. She ends up coming back and opening a clinic, a birth control clinic in the teens. And then in 1921, she establishes the American Birth Control League, which would later become Planned Parenthood. The explosion of the new woman, the fight for birth control, the emergence of queerness in spaces really begins to pull America apart as people will continue to fight over what is the proper mainstream culture, what is America. Central in this war are the Comstock laws that really define censorship halfway through the 20th century. Anthony Comstock, who was the U.S. Postal Inspector and Secretary of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, his dates are 1844 to 1915. He essentially waged a war against any kind of distribution of access to sex education, birth control information. All of these things were deemed pornographic, and he ended up fighting for legislation that would make it illegal to distribute any kind of things like this through the mail. The Comstock laws were very effective. We see rapid censorship that emerges here, and these are actually some of the laws that Margaret Sanger was persecuted under. Unfortunately, just like in the Gilded Age, this idea of wealth inequality becomes very central in the 1920s. You can see that the golden decade was awesome for a lot of people. A lot of Americans were able to own cars and have jobs in cities and do things that literally were unavailable decades prior to this. But the wealth divide was continuing to grow in the same way that it did in the Gilded Age. By 29, 1% of the banks owned half of the financial resources of the country. Top 5% made more than the bottom 60% combined. People who were wanting to take part of the consumer culture that was sweeping the nation didn't have access to it. Despite all of the mass marketing and the explosion of technological advancement of cars and access to speakeasies and all of these things that seem so awesome, by the end of the decade, over 75% of the people didn't have a radio or a washing machine. Farms were hit particularly hard. World War I had made this mass production of agriculture necessary. There was an explosion in agricultural output because of war economy. The end of the war had crashed the demand. Advancements in mechanization and fertilizer had made production outpace demand. For the first time in American history, agriculture was declining, and many of these people began to move to the city, which displaced demographics and heightened older problems associated with the Gilded Age. There were also racial issues that continued. We saw how through the Progressive era, the issue of race was something that the Progressives were unable to overcome. We see the emergence, the rebirth of the KKK here in Atlanta. And in the 20s, the KKK spread not just here in the South, but all the way as far as California and Oregon, with millions of Americans joining. The new KK had not just focused on the suppression of blacks in the South, but was specifically focused on anti-Catholic immigration, on the expansion of a very particular version of Christianity. It was anti-feminism, anti-new woman, anti-black, anti-immigration, anti-Catholic, anti-unions, and even fought back against corporations. The reemergence of the KKK testifies to a virulent strand of Protestant Christian nationalism, of white supremacy that stays still to this day. The 1920s would also see the emergence of the fundamentalist movement. If you remember when we talked about last time in the Progressive era, there was this shift in American Christianity, particularly in certain cities like New York, that would focus on feeding the poor, helping the homeless, doing essentially social things that focused on the here and now and not the afterlife. In reaction to this, fundamentalists, or people that believed in that Christianity should be defined by certain fundamental truths, began to emerge in opposition to the social gospel. These more conservative Christians would say that true Christianity only supports the virgin birth, the death and atonement of Jesus Christ, the physical resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the afterlife, the inerrancy of Scripture. They believe that the Bible, the way it is written, is perfectly true all the way through. It has to be interpreted literally. They would reject the social gospel as a perversion of Christianity influenced by socialism or perhaps communism. The true Christianity has to reject such a social interpretation, otherwise it will be led into atheism. Fundamentalists in the 1920s would specifically target the teaching of evolution in schools. They would say that such was a secularization of society that was pulling America away from its true Christian roots. Presidential election of 1928, Herbert Hoover ran for president. Hoover presented himself as a defender of American individualism, which he had actually written a book about. He saw himself as a progressive in a lot of senses, but he believed, much like in the old Gilded Age perspective, is that progressive or any kind of charitable thing, social action, should be privatized. He would argue for associational action, or a corollary in the present would essentially be that churches or nonprofits should do social actions, and it wasn't the role of the government to do such. You can see how this is more of a Gilded Age philosophy, a more laissez-faire approach. At the time, he thought that there wouldn't be an issue with this. In 1929, his inauguration, he's quoted as saying, "We in America today are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. The poorhouse is vanishing among us." Unfortunately, however, 8 months later, the Roaring Twenties came to a crashing halt. Heels of Hoover's election, the stock market crashed. This instituted what's known as the Great Depression. The start of the Great Depression has been a long-standing debate between historians, economists, cultural critics, and theorists. Clear that there were some problems. Congressional investigations showed that there was massive irregularities. Richard Whitney, president of the New York Stock Exchange, was arrested for cheating customers, including widows and orphans. So it's pretty clear that the complete hands-off trust in the boom and bust cycle, probably pointing to the need for a little bit more government regulation than was present. Whatever the case, the stock market crumbled 90% or more. GM stock went from almost $80 to $8. 4/5 of the Rockefeller fortune disappeared almost overnight. The GDP fell by almost a third. 25% of the population couldn't find work. Birth rates were lowest. Suicide rates were highest. Sayings like, "This is the American way of life," or "Something safe as a bank," really rang hollow. And Americans begin for the first time to really point the finger at the administration. Remember, Herbert Hoover came in and believed that while progressive reform was needed, it should be something that was privatized, right? Associational action, churches, charities, nonprofits. Very quickly, as people became desperate and destitute, you have, hundreds of children in bread lines, whole cities. I mean, literally, they would go outside of cities and they would create these shanty towns where large portions of the American population were homeless. They would come together and make these tent cities. And they began to point the finger at the administration and all these shanty towns. Hoovervilles. If they were using newspapers to cover up, they would call these Hoover blankets. They would literally go out and try to hunt wild rabbits in towns and stuff. And they would call these Hoover hogs, right? People would pull out their empty pockets, right? And these are an empty pocket showing that you didn't have any money were Hoover flags. And you can see how there is a shift towards wanting the federal government to come in and provide some kind of economic stability, some kind of prevention from the boom and bust cycle that created the Great Depression. Hoover himself had said that downturns were normal. This was part of the normal up and down cycle, and that the American economy would rebound. Towards the end, he did pump some money into some aid, but by then it was pretty clear that it was a little too late. He continued to say that the tide was turning or had turned, which caused people not to trust him. By 1932, Hoover admitted that associational action wasn't fixing things, and he began to, push some relief through. He ended up signing legislation that would provide aid and begin to push for federal jobs in order to create employment for American citizens. But to the end, he believed that providing direct aid to people would corrupt their moral character. Hoover's more idealistic approach would eventually pave the way for a new president that would take a more pragmatic, more progressive approach than Hoover was willing to take himself. When we come back, we'll talk about the New Deal and how maybe it did or didn't pull America out of the Great Depression.